Good morning, everyone. I think that we should go ahead and get started. We have a really great panel, and we only have an hour. So I want to go ahead and get things started and make sure that there's time for questions and discussion afterward. So this panel is the distributed denial of democracy: threats to democratic processes online. This is organized by the National Democratic Institute, the Center for International Media Assistance, and the Center for International Private Enterprise. And the way that this panel is going to work is I'm going to open it up with a brief statement. I'm going to introduce our 6 panelists. Each of them are going to have 5 minutes to discuss the issue that they're here to talk about from their region. And then we're going to open it up to questions and answers from the audience here and also from the audience online. And my name is Daniel O'Malley, and I'm from the Center for International Media Assistance. So let's go ahead and get started. The distributed denial of democracy refers to the online use of multiple actors or channels to deny citizens access to or to interrupt the flow of legitimate political discourse, thereby undermining democratic culture and practice. Thus, while a distributed denial of service attack, a DDoS attack, takes down a specific website, a distributed denial of democracy attack attempts to remove certain voices from what appears to be an open and participatory dialogue. As the prevalence of internet-based media platforms has grown, so has online activity by actors and individuals that seek to silence or exclude voices online. Anti-democratic actors have created innovative new techniques that turn the attributes of the internet against open institutions, harnessing hyperpartisanship, filter bubbles, and age-old human biases accelerated with content stolen by criminals or outright disinformation to erode trust in institutions and increase social strife. These efforts, which are often coordinated and well-resourced, are frequently harder to detect and have the overall effect of undermining civic engagement. The challenges to democracy online are not the product of governments alone. For example, at the Center for International Media Assistance, where I work, we have noted how social media platforms are undermining the business model that supports independent media and the circulation of high-quality news and information. This weakens the broader media ecosystem and also undermines democracy, which depends on a robust free press. In a similar fashion, online violence against politically active women is much more distributed and has the ultimate effect of silencing voices of women and discouraging their participation in public dialogue. We need to find ways to make sure that the internet fulfills its initial promise of connecting people and enabling them to become more active participants in the democratic process. Ensuring that the future of the internet empowers universal human rights and democratic values will require cooperation from government policymakers, the private sector, and civil society. This is why it is so important for us to discuss democracy and the internet at places like the IGF that are multi-stakeholder. And I would now like to briefly introduce this panel, which offers a variety of different perspectives from the private sector, from media, civil society activists, among others. And I'm really looking forward to their comments on the faces that they're seeing to democratic processes online and the ways that we need to work together to make sure that every region, every sector is heard in these debates. So I'm going to start. To my right is Hanan Boujemi. She is a senior tech policy expert with more than a decade of experience in the economic and legal aspects of internet policy and governance. And she is also the co-chair of the IGF's Dynamic Coalition on Internet Rights and Principles. And she's originally from Morocco, but she's now living in the UK. Next to her is Mishi Chowdhury. She's the legal director of the Software Freedom Law Center, based in New Delhi. She consults with and advises businesses in the US, Europe, India, China, and Korea. She's a member of the Bar Council of Delhi, licensed to appear before the Supreme Court in India, all the state high courts in India, and also in the state of New York. And next to her is Jahan Ara, who is the president of PASHA, the Pakistan Software Houses Association, which is the representative trade body for IT and information technology-enabled services businesses in Pakistan. She is an entrepreneur and social activist and a strong propagator of extending the power and use of information and communication technologies beyond pure traditional businesses to empower and enable communities. Next to her is Marta Roldos. She's an Ecuadorian journalist and anti-corruption activist. She has been deputy of the National Congress, and she was also a member of the Ecuadorian Constituent Assembly. And she is currently the executive director of Fundación Mil Hojas, which is an organization committed to defending democracy and human rights in Ecuador. And next to Marta is Chris Doughton, who is the Chief Innovation Officer at the National Democratic Institute. Chris has designed and implemented programs in dozens of countries which apply integrated, context-appropriate technology to reach more citizens, track political processes, and improve organizing capabilities. And last but not least is Matt Chesson, who is a diplomat and technologist who has served in some of the most challenging assignments in the U.S. Foreign Service. Matt has also led implementation of an open source crowd working platform called Open Opportunities. And his particular expertise here that he's going to be sharing with us is how artificial intelligence enhances computational propaganda. So now I'm going to ask the speakers to give 5-minute interventions, and we're going to start with Marta.
Hi, I would talk to you briefly about the experience in Ecuador. In Ecuador, for us, internet was like the last frontier. We had an authoritarian regime, we had a GOG law and a communication law that was a censorship law, and then most of the investigative journalism moved to the internet in order to be able to keep publishing, investigating, and publishing. The problem is that the repression moved to the internet too by the government. Since we are not China, and our government didn't have the capacity to put up Great Wall, and they didn't want that too because they didn't want to be labeled as a dictatorship. So they did things more intelligently, and they devised, we got all the sort of things that now we are seeing around the world. We got troll centers, Putin-style troll centers. We got bots. We got a lot of attacks against women journalists in general, but women journalists in particular. We got also a lot of propaganda. In the case of Ecuador, it was curious because the fake news came from the government, not from the civil society. And the government used all these devices to spread fake news. But we also are like a very successful experience of overcoming these attempts of the government. Like in 2011, 2012, it was people got afraid to talk on the social media, and then we got a lot of participants, mainly investigative journalist platforms, the Lawyers Association. People got into the media, important players got into the media to counteract the discourse. So when you have, maybe you teach the people, you teach the public to discriminate against contents. And then you have a very normal person asking someone who was putting content on the social media, what is your source? Please put your source, or are you sure about that? And then you have people that have learned in these years to discriminate this kind of content. So they try to keep disinformation campaigns, but now people knows better. Maybe you can do it for a day, but like the next day, the disinformation is contested but by informant people. But that is because, you know, mainly players got into the social media. You have MPs in social media, you have lawyers in social media, you have a lot of human rights activists, feminists, all in social media. And we began to counteract also the attacks, namely the a teacher, a woman teacher who was head of the teachers union, their photograph, her nude photographs were posted by people related to these government troll centers to defamate her. But all the women, like 5 minutes after that, all the feminists, not only feminists, journalists, all people was pouring support towards her and were condemning what they were doing. So it was very effective. Now we are in a kind of transition in Ecuador. We were able to still to keep publishing the news about corruption. We were able to push an human rights agenda because all the main players got into the social media too. So that's Ecuadorian experience. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Marta. And I think we'll now turn to Jihan, who can tell us about some of the experiences that they're having in Pakistan.
Thank you. So in Pakistan, since I represent the private sector, I would like to first own up to the fact that until about 9-10 years ago, the IT sector in Pakistan was very insular. We only engaged with government on policy in a very civilized fashion. You know, we would write to them or we would hold meetings with them. We wouldn't be very aggressive. We thought that was the work of activists. And until in 2007, when the government tried to push through the cybercrime bill, it's when we woke up. And we realized that we would have to do something. And I think one of the smartest things we did was we used the multi-stakeholder approach, and we connected with activists, with media organizations, and with all stakeholders whom we knew were involved in policy making. So that way, you know, we got together, we had meetings, we shared what our concerns were, and we approached the government and lawmakers with one voice. So that made us a lot stronger. And that group over the years has become stronger and has engaged with parliamentarians, with all stakeholders together. And I think that makes it a very powerful group. And that's how democracy is supposed to function in any case. So some of the things that have been happening as far as Pakistan is concerned is, other than the cybercrime bill, which we continue to be engaged in with government, they have finally made it into an act. And there are still some areas of concern, although having engaged with them, we have been able to push through some of our concerns, and it is not as draconian as it was when they first drafted it. But, you know, multiple takedowns of, you know, platforms, mobile services being shut down under the guise of security, those kind of things continue to happen. And that affects communication. It also affects essential services like emergency services. When you can't work on your mobile, your number is inoperative, you cannot contact emergency services, you can't contact services like Uber, and multiple services now that citizens, business people all depend on a regular basis. So those are things that we continue to engage with government on. And I think that's something that we will have to make sure that they understand. I think one of the things that I have seen myself is that there are always champions within parliamentary groups and policymakers whom, if you engage with them and educate them, because sometimes it is ignorance that results in some of the worst policies that come through. If you engage with them, educate them, then they become your champions. And we've held press conferences with activists, with politicians and media to make sure that the message gets across, that people understand what it is we're fighting and that it's not all a lot of noise. Activists, of course, have, whether it's activists who are younger, who have now engaged on social media, or whether it is women activists especially who've been engaging with government for the last 30 years. They're not that powerful as far as social media, internet, and all that is concerned, but the younger people are now engaging with them and making sure their voices are also heard on the internet. Many of these women do not want to be openly visible on social media or on the internet simply because they feel threatened. So, it is our responsibility as technologists as well as the activists amongst us who can teach them how to keep themselves safe and secure on the internet. So we've all been working together, and I think that's resulted in a very powerful stance that we've been able to take. Of course, the challenges continue, and we will have to continue to make sure that any policies that are made or any threats to privacy, there's no data protection law. Platforms who sometimes tend to be very compliant with the government simply because they want to continue to make money. Also, telecom providers whose licenses depend on the government, sharing of our data with anybody and everybody, those kind of things are things that concern us. But I'm just grateful that the private sector, the IT sector has woken up and is now actually actively engaged. Many of the IT business people are now more activists than you would, that you would even, you would expect from people who were otherwise in suits and only engaged with government in a very professional manner. So this is something that's happening in Pakistan, and that's what I wanted to share.
Great, thank you. And I think that's a really powerful story of kind of different sectors working together, as you said. Once you spoke in a united voice, people listened, and that you were able to find champions in government, which is really important in these cases. I'm going to now turn to Mishi, who's going to talk a little bit about what the problems that she's been working on and seeing in India.
Thank you. Just for clarification, I'm the legal director of Software Freedom Law Center based out of New York. I am the president and founding director of SFLC.in. I'm going to be talking only about my work in India. I think I usually find that problems now, no matter which jurisdiction you are talking about, there perhaps is a common thread which runs through. So I could just shut up and say, you already heard it and you will hear it. But I'm going to just concentrate on a little bit of a different sliver here in the same light. I think it's true that the political parties have figured out what is the power of internet to shape the discourse. I also think that primetime television takes its cues nowadays from what's going on in social media. And therefore, the entire discussion about what is important and what should be highlighted has now become a part of the cacophony which the internet feeds into. The topic itself, the distributed denial of democracy, I think the problem is itself may be too large for the solution, because it's not just the net that's at fault, but I think we as human race as well, because we're the people who actually make the internet. We all started and we wanted freedom of every brain to learn, but we also have a lot of intermediate objectives, and then we get distracted. We have intermediate objectives of winning elections to making more money and various other things. The power of the net for shaping politics or misshaping of politics, I think the governments are finding it very hard to have a consistent focus on the human effect on the net, as much as they've already figured out the political or the economic effect of it. Where I come from right now, shutdowns, which is the complete blanket shutdowns of the network connection, is the all or nothing response of the states to the problems they think cannot be solved. Shutdowns, of course, induce censorship, they increase despotism, but they don't actually solve the problem of this internet, which is now something which we have created. It's a blunderbuster. It suits the state power sometimes, but in no regards help what the society actually need. It does provide people with an experience of the limitation of distraction, which is good for like maybe 10 minutes again. my work and my organization's work is cataloged on something called the Internet Shutdowns Tracker. You can find it on internetshutdowns.in. It shows that in India, the shutting down of the net is the constant locating problem, and it's a system. It's broken over here, it's broken over there, it's always broken in Kashmir. It's really an example of the way in which the government has yet to figure out how it can help the society deal with the net. It's mostly about aggression and hostility, which is what the government's usual explanation is. It's about rumor control. It's about avoidance of communal violence, national security. It's never about how do we use government's authority to help create a better environment. It's definitely the crudest form of harm limitation from their end. Just in terms of numbers, we've had 65 internet shutdowns in India in 2017 alone. 25 times it was killed in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. For 3 months, from June 18 to September 18th, Darjeeling, which is a place in East India, it was completely covered in darkness. Our shutdown tracker also goes and tracks about whether it was mobile shutdown or was the fixed line internet shutdown. Most developing countries, the access to internet comes through mobile network. 94.3% of Indians who are online connect to mobile and not fixed line internet. So once the mobile network goes down, that means their connection to internet is totally snipped. We track stories also because all those statistics are important, but after all, then they become just numbers, and personal stories do tell you what's really going on. People are not able to pay their loans, their monthly installments. Students are not able to apply to universities because now it's only one place, and if they have to apply to universities which are not in the same part as they live in, then if there's no internet and no fixed line or mobile internet, it's difficult for them to run their regular life. And if it's not there for 3 months, like in Darjeeling, then you can only imagine that after high school, if something which is an equivalent of an SAT and you're not able to take it because there's just no network connection, how does it impact your future in comparison to the rest of the country which is actually applying? We also got certain stories. All of these are cataloged on our website, where surgeons said that there's now a move to move everything online, and a lot of times they're not able to access their own patients' data before they can go and continue with some kind of surgeries which are scheduled. So it's small businesses now rely on communication services such as WhatsApp. People take their orders, deliver their orders using these services, and once they have no access to it, these are people who do not have a lot of capital which they can rely on when there is no network connection. We do appreciate, having worked with the government, to understand that the policeman's job is maintenance of public law and order on the ground. And if they're doing it right, they're doing it without much collateral damage. That's what one at least expects usually. Generally speaking, the net shutdown imposes a fair amount of collateral damage. That's the conclusion we have come up with. And the policeman's tool in this case are extremely limited, and the fact that they have this one, it means it's going to be grotesquely overused. Not because that there is any justification for this, but it's like, well, to every hammer, every problem is a nail, and if you only have one hammer, so you shut down the net for whatever good it will bring to you. I also particularly think that the comprehensive surveillance which now exists in order to enable advertising has become the political economy of the net. So much so that now it's worth for platform companies to be able to carry people's packets at their own expense in return for the right of being able to look into what people are talking. Various examples in Free Basics by Facebook still exists in many other countries, and how this works in view of democracy is not only now a developing country problem, and we are watching it play out in different parts of the world where suddenly it has caught everybody's attention. I also think that there's an overbalancing in this direction, because when there are political troll armies of one political party trying to drown the discourse, then the promise of the net that it's going to democratize discussion and everybody will have a chance to talk takes a very different color of its own. And when women and when other particular groups, which are vulnerable groups, 2-3 years ago started raising a problem that we are being really harassed and this is going beyond control, a lot of platforms and a lot of people were said, well, if you don't like it, just get off the platform or develop a thicker skin. But that's only just telling you what is coming, and now we live in that era when there's not just vulnerable people or women who do have opinions because they are equally citizens, sometimes smarter, which can only be my belief, but when they are kept off some kind of discussions, you know that there will be everybody else who will face the same thing. So I think that's where we are in most of the places.
Great, thank you, Mishi. And I like the thing that you pointed out there at the end, that these are issues that are global and not just in specific countries. Sometimes we see some of the issues like the free basics debate in India, in those regions, but these are really global issues that we're all trying to grapple with. So, and I think that's a really important point to highlight. I'm now going to turn to Chris Doughton from NDI.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Hi, folks. Great to be here. At NDI, we work a lot on improving citizen access to political processes, and particularly around elections. And so we've seen a huge level of impact on the political conversations, discussions that take place at those most sensitive of pivot points in the history of a country, which is an election, where things can really swing dramatically based on a sometimes very, very small change in outcome. So, you know, with the rise of a lot of these challenges to democracy online, whether it's disinformation or trolling or so on, people will often poo-poo this a little bit, say, well, you know, this is not new. Mark Twain talked about how rumors go all the way around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. Or Thomas Jefferson ran a whole series of newspapers that did stuff that any of us would define as fake news, scurrilous attacks on John Adams. So that may be true, but something that I think that really is new and different is in the field of computational propaganda, that's using computers to accelerate or increase the flow of targeted messaging online. Something that I think is new is the problem that we refer to as manufactured consensus. So, you know, there's a number of things that are true and challenging when it comes to disinformation and political communications online. You know, it turns out that Mishi referred a bit to human psychology here. You know, it turns out that like consistency of messaging isn't important. It doesn't matter how many times you get hit with variants on different messages that are false or incorrect. That will still serve to undermine a narrative. You know, we see a lot of attacks on what had been gatekeepers of truth, or kind of authorities or elites that had been before sort of people helped us establish what was correct or what was not. That whole process is being undermined. But what we think is, I think in some ways most disruptive, is this challenge of the tapping into humans' herd instincts. We're social animals, we're communal animals, and so there's a huge amount of implicit pressure just built into our nature to kind of go along with what seems to be the kind of the common opinion of everything. And so that's something that can be deeply problematic online, thanks to the problems of bots and computational propaganda. If a message is relayed via a whole bunch of different messengers, or what we think are different messengers, and we see that popping up in our news feeds or in our Twitter streams or even in our messaging apps over and over, then it will appear to us as though that is what everybody thinks. Now, that may in fact not be in the least bit true. This is something that we've seen a lot in technology, with crowdsourcing in general, anything that people tend to use volume as a proxy for accuracy or intent. One of my favorite examples is when there was an open survey of where Justin Bieber should do his next concert. Pyongyang was the selection of the masses, not because that's where most of Justin Bieber's fans wanted him to go, but enough other people jumped on it. The same sort of thing can be used for much less humorous purposes by trying to convince people that something that's completely untrue is the case, or that they should vote a certain way, or refrain from voting at all because everybody is equally corrupt and problematic, and the whole democratic system can be thereby undermined. We see this playing out globally, whether it's things like Peña bots in Mexico, the extraordinarily effective use of Facebook Messenger in the Philippines with President Duterte, and in many other countries around the developed and developing world, we're seeing this take place. So it's hard to know what the answer to some of this is. I think Marta mentioned how in Ecuador people have become more informed, more intelligent consumers, and so there is certainly a literacy question to this. People can be a little bit more aware. It also may be that the switch to messaging applications may actually help reduce some of these threats. When we're not in the kind of the open public spheres of Twitter, Facebook, it may be that some of these smaller conversations that are more typically between people that you actually do know may be less impacted by this. We would certainly advocate for more of when possible, labeling bots online to try and help people distinguish what is legitimate conversation from actual organic humans to what is being pushed or propagated. But if the genie is truly out of the bottle and there's very little that can be done to stem the flow of computational propaganda via bots, we may be in a weird world where democracy advocates have to start training who we consider the good guys, pro-democratic forces, on how to build and use their own bots, and that we may end up in a world where the bots are all dueling it out for democracy. So leave it at that. Look forward to questions later.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And Matt, now you're going to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence, which is kind of like the next level of these bot armies that Chris was mentioning.
Yep, thank you very much. My work has focused on the intersection of artificial intelligence and computational propaganda and how we combat disinformation online. My government, the United States, is still trying to fully understand this phenomenon. And I want to talk about some of the research that I've done on looking at some of these emerging AI technologies and how they can impact computational propaganda. But first, I just want to put in a word for preserving the freedom of expression and avoiding censorship. So the United States government promotes a vision for the internet that is interoperable, reliable, secure, and open. And a big part of that openness is this freedom of expression. We believe that people have the same rights online as they do offline. And the internet's got a tremendous amount of value to us from our ability to freely associate with each other, share ideas, express ideas and opinions, and to do that free of interference or censorship. And so we don't want to utilize we don't want to take this problem of disinformation online and use it as a reason to censor free speech online. So that being said, I just want to play on a couple of things that Chris had already mentioned here. So what are folks doing with some of these technology tools? Doxing and bullying is very common, where they'll release personal information about people in an attempt to keep them quiet, and then they use these armies of bots basically to reinforce those messages and those threats against people. They'll do hashtag spamming is another common one. Activists are trying to organize via hashtag. They'll just spam that hashtag with a bunch of garbage information so that the activists can't actually communicate with each other or organize. Most of these techniques violate platform terms of service, so they're not technically illegal, but they do violate Twitter, Facebook, and other social media platforms' terms of service. And then, what Chris mentioned was this use of networks of fake social media accounts. These are accounts that impersonate real people, and then they try and manufacture this consensus. So these are sort of the challenges that we're we're facing and that we're dealing with. But we can't be judging the actual speech that's coming out, because that gets us into the realm of determining truth from fiction. What we really need to focus on are the bad actors, the bad intentions, and then the bad effects that they're having on communication online. So now let's talk about some of the emerging artificial intelligence technologies that are going to impact computational propaganda. And also, to be clear on this, the technologies by themselves are not inherently bad. There's nothing inherently bad about these technologies. They will be used for a lot of good, but they can be used for some of these malicious purposes, and we need to be aware of what these are. Very quickly, what is artificial intelligence? We're not talking about sentient computers here. AI is popularly thought of as machines that exhibit intelligence, and that definition's fine. Better definition is to think about it like biology or chemistry. It's a field of problems to solve that deal with pattern recognition, autonomy, perception, recognition, learning, and decision-making. So it's a better way to think about it like that. It's a little more inclusive, and it gets us out of this realm of thinking about what Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking talk about. And so let's talk about some of these technologies. So chatbots are increasingly able to have human-like conversations. So Microsoft's Xiao is probably the most popular one. It was a Weibo top influencer. People have proclaimed love for Xiao. They tell it they wish she was a real girl and they want to marry her. So people develop these very close relationships with these chatbots, and they're only going to get better and better at having conversations that basically emulate human beings. AI systems are getting really good at dynamically creating content. So books and screenplays, they create some really good visual art and some really good music now. What's a little more concerning to me is actually the sort of these audio and video manipulation technologies. You might have seen some of these where you can sort of do this real-time manipulation of real videos online. There's one out of Stanford where they manipulate Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin's face in a YouTube video, and then there's some that basically dynamically generate speeches that Obama never made. So these tools are going to generate all of this content and basically create this sort of pliable reality where they're modifying and shaping events in real time and creating fake events. You have affective computing and psychometric profiling. These tools are really good at figuring out what people's emotions are and communicating to them in an emotional way, and also figuring out what people's personalities are, their sexual orientation, political leanings. You can figure out all of these things with just a very few pieces of data, and then use it to create personalized propaganda and disinformation. These are digital tools, so once you create one, it's very easy to then create many more of them. They learn, so they can optimize their behavior, and they can be working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So while we're still trying to shape responses to things, they can be out shaping narratives. And so we're moving to this era where we're going to shift from this bot-driven computational propaganda that are just pushing out human-generated content to this autonomous computational propaganda that's pushing out this machine-driven content. And that's going to complicate some of these existing problems that we're seeing with computational propaganda. Also, just interesting sort of cultural note, we're going to see a lot more of these machine-driven accounts communicating with each other and sharing information with each other. And so we're going to have other intelligences moving into the online communication space. And that's a big unknown as to how that's going to work and what the impacts of that are going to be on human communication online. So I wrote a paper about this, and it's called The MADCOM Future. It was published with the Atlantic Council if you want to read more about this. I'm a big proponent of artificial intelligence. It's going to be probably one of the most beneficial technologies that mankind's ever produced. But we do need to be aware of this coming wave of machine-driven communication, and we want to make sure that it doesn't interfere with free expression online. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Matt. And now we're going to turn to Hanan, whose expertise at global internet governance forums, working on internet rights and principles, is one of the reasons why we have her on this panel, because we've just heard a number of different issues from government trolling, surveillance in Pakistan, the blunt use of shutdowns in India, also the comprehensive surveillance as a business model, computational propaganda, bots. I mean, we've heard about a lot of different things that are all going to shape how people engage in the future and how people participate in democratic processes. What are some of the things that we can do, and where might this go in the space of internet governance?
Okay, well, I'm not sure I have some magical solutions to all this, but we've heard a lot about shutdowns, which are the major issue in the last maybe 2 years or 3 years. There are other problems with platforms in general. Is the mass production of content that is pushed through different channels, and I call them content platforms because I don't want to talk anymore about, social media. So we need to understand that phenomenon, at various levels. So it's not only political. These contents, they literally shape public opinion, and in certain instances, they basically change the narrative, and we all do have to worry about that. But how do we solve all this? I was very pleased to hear all the stories and all the case studies from Pakistan, and how the private sector turned to be an efficient actor to affect what's happening at the local level, and open channels with governments, so you can address a little bit of these issues since they're concerned with what's happening. They are almost the extended arm of the government. So when shutdowns happen, we need to understand that operators get sometimes direct orders from, I don't know, from the Ministry of Defense, or it depends on the country. So how do we solve all this? So our work at the coalition is specifically concentrating on using what we call soft norms, common, framework that we can define at the global level to address these things. Why? Because we think that regulation is usually slow to adapt to technology, and also hampers, in many instances, democratic values in general. That's why we focus on principles, because we thought that we can adopt a holistic view of what society needs, what are the core values that we all need to subscribe to in order to have a democratic space, whether offline or online. Now, what's happening in technology is worrying beyond the shutdowns. We do have a lot of decisions now which affects how people are going to connect to the internet. And I think what's happening vis-a-vis the network neutrality discussion in North America in general is considered like it's a turning point actually in our field. And I think we were fighting for democratic countries for a long time to be established. I think the next 10 years will be probably focusing on how we can democratize the internet. I expect this topic to be a top item in the agenda of our discussions here in Policy Fora. So the Internet Rights and Principle Coalition have developed a set of principles, 10 principles, based on a charter that was conceived a few years back in the context of the IGF. And it was a collaborative work which included actors from various disciplines: legal, government, private sector, activists, and civil society in general. The agreement was to design principles that are easy enough to digest for the normal public, but it turned out that the principles were actually handy even for governments. So unexpectedly, we managed to influence some of the important policy processes in different countries, be it in New Zealand, Italy, in different countries which use the principles as a baseline to design their own policies. I think a lot of progressive governments see a point in establishing a common framework of values, core values that we all can base on to do our work on the internet. So I think the work that we've done along 9 or 10 years now has evolved a lot, and we're very pleased to see other organizations defining the value of our achievements and basing on it, so we can move forward, because there is a lot happening. 10 years ago there was no shutdowns, but now we see the importance of stipulating how important it is to preserve these principles for democratic values, and that applies to many fields. And I think the missing discussion in this forum was about media, and I point that out. So we don't have a media practitioner group specialized in highlighting all the issues that comes with media development or media in general. I think we probably should start a separate track at the IGF so we can look at all the issues specific to the media sector. and how we can link it to what's happening in the content industry, powered by technology and powered by the internet. So there's a lot happening, and myself, I'm still learning, what's going on in the media sector. So I think if we agree to maybe combine our work to, integrate the set of values we've been working on to encompass other sectors like media, that will be great. And I hope, other countries or other organizations will adopt, these principles and try to promote them. We were contacted by some Russian fellows in this meeting. Somebody sent me an email yesterday to say that, oh, your charter is translated to Russian, and he handed it to me. I don't know him, he just came across our work, and they made a commentary as well on certain sections that we need probably to adapt to the Russian context, because we keep, adding, points to the charter. So, I mean, I think we think it's great, we really appreciate, people going through the details of the charter and finding a value in doing it. So as I said earlier, I think we should focus more on probably agreeing on a set of values, and not rely entirely 100% on regulation to make things happen, because we know how things can be slow at the legal side. Thank you.
Great, thank you, and and thank you to all of our panelists. What we're going to do now is we're going to open up the floor to questions. So we're going to take. Do we have any questions from the online space?
No, unfortunately, we don't.
Okay, so we're going to take 3 questions from the floor, and then we're going to let our panel respond to that. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand now. Yes.
I have a quick and short question. First of all, it's been a fantastic panel, and I really liked all the speakers. But just to the last speaker. My name's Joanna Bryson. I'm a professor of artificial intelligence. And I also work at the Princeton Center for Information Technology Policy, so maybe I can work with some of you there. But I'm at the University of Bath. Okay, long introduction, short question. Hannah, you said that I agree with you that regulation can be slow and principles are really useful in getting the soft law out. But in your first introduction, you said that regulation can actually be anti-democratic. And I think of law as ultimately we do want to capture the good ideas and push it forward. So and also I think most of artificial intelligence does happen already in a regulated space, and that what we need to do is improve the regulation, because it's not built to purpose as things change. So I always think of regulation as something we also need to, as a parallel process, catch up. So why do you say it's actually bad for democracy?
And hold that thought. We'll take a couple more.
Yes, Boris Engelson, a local journalist freelance. And since I have attended only half the session, my question will be at best half sensible. If you look for Grameen Bank or Mohammed Yunus online, you will get easily hundreds of articles praising microcredit, Grameen Bank, and Mohammed Yunus. If you have any doubts, then it will take half a day or even more to find some documented article analyzing beyond just the slogans, the realities of microcredit. What do I mean by that? I mean that in a world of not information poverty, but information excess, censorship and manipulation go this way. It is why some cliches are plenty and some truths are hidden. And this mirrors, to a large extent, the own prejudices of the public. And this leads me to the second point, is that in the case of Ecuador, what makes things all the more difficult is that Ecuador government has a good image with the civil society, rightly or wrongly. They can hide behind the socially progressive, etc., rhetorics. And so it will be very difficult to convince the civil society of some truth, because they will feel that they are stabbing their own bodies in the back.
Great, thank you. And do we have one more question from the floor and another intervention? Okay, I'll turn it over to Hanan first, and then we'll open up the floor to the second question, which is a good one.
Oh, thank you, Daniel. Okay, so yeah, well, I said that on purpose. You know what? Because law is interpreted in different ways according to the context. And when I mentioned that regulation can be slow to adapt and it hampers in certain contexts democratic values, I meant it because I worked a lot in the Middle East, and I can assure you that implemented legislation specific to the internet is not necessarily reflecting, the democratic values we believe in. As an example, freedom of expression. So that kind of statement is maybe, general enough, but at the same time specific, because we can see that, happening in certain contexts. I know that law means something completely different in the US, but in other regions, it's a completely different story.
Great, thank you. And now the second question about excessive information as a form of manipulation or censorship, situation in Ecuador. Anyone?
I would like to address both questions. Sorry, sometimes I would like to be able to speak Spanish because I would do it faster. But the thing is, I think something that you said a minute ago is that we need to think how to foster good journalism. Because part of the disinformation thing is that you need to foster good journalism. No? You need to be able to find ways to convince people, maybe to raise money, like this multi-stakeholder way of raise money for good projects of journalism. Because that's the question, to do good journalism takes time. It took us, Mil Hojas, 6 months to investigate how our highways were building in Ecuador, because it was the main propaganda of our government, Now we have highways. And then we find that some of our highways cost 10 times or to 100 times more than a kilometer in the in Europe. So but it took to put 2 persons 6 months to go through database and misinformation. So it takes time. It costs, even if you charge little and you have underpaid journalists, it costs time and it costs a lot of effort, and people both need to value that. And in the Ecuadorian case, gratefully, it's not the case anymore about our government. They are in the last government, Correa, has a very low popularity, but it was in a high day. And when he was in his heyday, the ones who were pushing for the truth, we were persecuted. I have friends that went to jail. I have indigenous people, leaders that went to jail just for protesting. So it's very revolutionary to give your the jungle to the Chinese mine companies. But I don't know, I think it's Twain that said that you cannot fool everybody all the time. You can fool somebody sometimes, but you cannot fool everybody all the time. But it has a cost, because until you have the possibility of fight back, of organized people. And it's very funny because in Ecuador we work like in several platforms at the same time. So I'm feminist too. So I have a huge group of feminist friends, and we have a WhatsApp group. And when some of them knew that another friend of us was being attacked by the government, and they were posting her nude photograph on Twitter and Facebook, we all organized through WhatsApp to act in Twitter and Facebook. So it takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of organizing, but it happens. Now in Ecuador we have had our shutdowns, but they don't say that they are shut down. They say, the cable broke. Where's the inform? Where's the report? No report. So And when you come from countries like ours, sometimes you are afraid of laws that may be well-intentioned, that can curtail freedom of expression, because freedom of expression is your last recourse. At least in Ecuador, we said, at least we have the derecho de pataleo, the kicking back, that crying, that's our last resource for help. And it helps, because when you cry, someone helps. Thank you.
So on this concept of sort of this volume of information, I mean, this is one of the tactics that malicious actors use to spread disinformation. And it's not just with bots. They'll actually create, dozens and dozens of web pages that look like local NGOs, they look like regional newspapers, they look like experts, but they're actually replicating the same disinformation over and over again. And part of that is to game the algorithms that basically push things up to trending topics, or game the Google search engine or things like that. And the platforms are always, it's always a struggle. They're trying to work on these things. But what they're actually trying to do is capture people into this ecosystem of disinformation. So they lure people in with emotionally pleasing information, and then they capture them in what looks like a rich media environment, where they see a lot of web pages replicating the same information, and then a lot of social media accounts that are saying the same thing. But those are all being run sort of by the same actors, or the same network of disinformation actors. And so, I think Chris mentioned, so we might need to use some of the same tools to counteract this. Now, we should never use disinformation, and we should never use unattributed accounts. That's just going to contribute to the problem. But a lot of the same tools can be used to actually direct streams of truthful information at these vulnerable and targeted populations to make sure that there's no gap that these malicious actors can actually fill. So I think that's something that we all need to think about, is how can we actually make sure that we use technology in a positive, proactive way to address some of these malicious actors.
Great. Mishi, you had something you want to say?
The various things I want to say, but this particular thing, I'm very interested, and also I think, Chris, you made a point earlier about if we move to messaging apps, perhaps that will have some impact. In my work in different places, what I've watched is once organized power figures out how to use certain tools, we are basically just catching up and cataloging things. Right now, I have watched how preparation for certain kind of elections is done. It's not to the conscious mind, it's to the subconscious mind. And if I can continue to get WhatsApp forwards, which is very common if you see in Latin America, in Africa, Southeast Asia, various other places, messages which are tailored to exactly what my issue is, in my dialect, and exactly what the messaging should be, is now constantly being used. So, and one of the issues these are real, like when there's a threat of communal violence and you speak to a policeman on the ground, which I've done because of internet shutdowns, is that they say, you guys want end-to-end encryption in WhatsApp, but then you don't want, when we have 1,000 people, thousands and thousands of people gathering on the ground, and they're going to disrupt the public law and order, what do we do? It's a very difficult answer at that time as a person who likes free speech and expression to give. About rule of law, I do work in two very different jurisdictions. I think one of the problems internet has done is that everybody believes people have the First Amendment right of the US Constitution. Most constitutions don't give us First Amendment rights. It's a free speech and expression with restrictions creeping in various other ways. So I would urge everybody, because this happens to me as a lawyer all the time for last several years, that you don't have the US First Amendment. You have a different limit. All your laws will go and face that limit, and that's how it would become. And the interesting thing, Hanan was saying that rule of law means different things in different jurisdictions, it can be unpacked in a lot of ways. One idea I just want to put out is, it's very unpopular, let me say, is that I would like to restore asynchronicity. If people would stop syncing people's time with internet's time, perhaps we will have a little more peace. It's like the silence we don't even let the silence begin to permeate our thinking again. nobody does their computing standing still. I do not understand what is the really extremely urgent email you are going to send in that line getting into this building, which you are holding up the entire line, but you have forgotten because you're so much into your phone. But you are just scrolling through shopping stuff. You can do it elsewhere. But people send emails, people send important information in elevators, walking on the road, and everywhere else. If people could do their computing standing still, preferably using a wire, because we've all now understood how secure Wi-Fi's are, perhaps we will have a little more sanity restored in the system. And we don't have to get instant gratification for everything. And it's like, it used to be that I think, therefore I am, but now it's like I'm tracked, therefore I am, or I tweet or Instagram, therefore I am. Otherwise, did that thing even happen?
Yeah.
Well,
Misunderstood. I mean, okay.
And
yeah,
so-
I have a quick one, a point for the
we
lady.
have to wrap up soon, so let's.
Yeah, well, I'm not anti-regulation because I just checked now my Twitter account and it's flooded, you know, with me anti-regulation. So obviously that's not what I said. So just to make that clear.
May I just add, I think, Rishi, you're not going to get this because in countries like yours and mine, where there are huge populations of young people, instant gratification is what they're looking for. So the latest technologies are being used to communicate either very important messages or very, very unimportant messages all the time. And this is going to continue. We are not going to be able to stop it. We might want sanity and peace. They do not.
Jahan, I totally agree about the fact you are observing, but I am more optimistic. I think it's very fascinating. If you've not grown up on fixed line, and you're a young person or an old person, and this is your first computer, it is very fascinating.
Yeah.
It is really very attractive. When I look at this thing and there's video on demand, there are pictures on demand, I can reach anybody, it's very fascinating. But time, over 2-3 years, when I actually begin to wrap my head around what this means and what it does, and if there is enough education about the impact of this on us as human race is talked more and more, I do think that people will understand. It's the same thing, privacy is dead. Privacy is only for Mark Zuckerberg. But today, privacy is for all of us. At least we want it, we demand it, even if we are not given, but we still demand it. So I think if the conversation started to say and discuss a little bit more, I know my idea is unpopular, and that's why you're right.
No, it's not unpopular. I'm just saying it may be unrealistic in the short term.
Short term,
It may
yes.
happen in the long term.
Let's play the long game.
Thank you. This has been a great panel. I really apologize that we've only had 1 hour to talk about these issues. I think it's good that we've ended on some positive notes from Mishi, who's much more optimistic. And I think we also heard some optimistic.
Jahan.
And so is Jahan. Also, from Martha, too, though, the way that the internet is enabling her feminist group to organize and mobilize. So, you know, we're not here to just say that the internet is bad and evil and a threat. It's about we need to marshal different social actors together to make sure that it remains a positive place for everyone. And I want to plug something that kind of piggybacking on Hanan's work on the Internet Rights and Principles Coalition, that our institutions, the National Democratic Institute, the Center for International Media Assistance, and Center for International Private Enterprise are working on, which is a principles framework for democratic processes. And we're kind of talking about these very issues and what these would look like in practice for people so that we can take that to civil society activists, to some governments that, you know, just need a little bit of education. And so you can check that out at openinternet.global. We'd love you to check that out, look at the principles that we have, the frameworks that we've created through a crowdsourcing effort with many of the people on this panel. And to join this community. And we hope that, and I agree with you, I think that this type of conversation is going to be one that's going to continue going forward and become even more important. So we want you to join our community and become a part of the discussion. That's openinternet.global. So great. Thank you very much. A round of applause for our panelists. They were excellent.